Hey, welcome back to GrubMed. Dr. Ari Grubner here, excited to be talking about another topic that I always found really confusing, really complex, and I think we can simplify it, we can make it cool and exciting. We're talking about acid-base status today. This is the kind of thing, I don't know about you, when I in med school and then taking care of patients, I always just freeze. I'm like, oh my gosh, it's so complex, right? You've got your respiratory part of things and your metabolic part of things, and you're not really sure how to put it all together, and you're interpreting blood gases and pH and CO2 and bicarb, and then, I don't know, I just feel like I just freeze and maybe I figured out a way to deal with it for test questions, but when it comes to real life in the hospital, it's just scary. It's a scary topic. We're going to make it really simple. I think it's going to be even simpler than other things you've dealt with. And we're going to break it down, and it's going to be really cool and exciting, and you will never be scared of acid-base status again. All right. So here's the thing, right? In med school, we have this whole system, I think we're taught, where we look at the pH and we figure out if it's acidotic or alkalotic, and then we look at the CO2 and the bicarb, and we have all of our numbers in front of us, and we kind of interpret them. What I found in the hospital very, very often is you don't always have a blood gas. But you often, or almost always, will have a CMP or a BMP, a chemistry, whatever you want to call it. You'll have a bicarb. And I think it took me a while to get used to starting from the back and working the other way. You understand what I'm saying? Sometimes all you got is a bicarb. You don't necessarily have your pH. You don't necessarily have your blood gas. And the first thing I want to say today is take a deep breath. Don't be scared. And number one, what we're going to do today is say, if someone has a low bicarb, even if that's the only number you have, you don't have a blood gas, you don't have anything else, immediately in your head, low bicarb, metabolic acidosis. Bicarb deficiency is a metabolic acidosis, just like low hemoglobin is anemia and low potassium is hypokalemia. A low bicarbonate is a metabolic acidosis. Now, everyone's going to yell and say, oh, blah, 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 I don't know. Yes, you can check your pH, and your pH might be normal. You might not actually be acidotic in the blood, or acidemic, really. But it doesn't matter. Maybe for some reason the blood itself compensated. Maybe the metabolic acidosis is itself compensating for a respiratory alkalosis. All of that is possible. But don't get confused. Don't get scared off. Immediately you see a low bicarb, this person has a metabolic acidosis. Now, so that's number one that I want to say today, the first take home from this. And if that's the only thing you take away, that is fine. Now, the question is, so what do you do? How do we approach a patient? So we have a 80-year-old dude who comes in for whatever you want, for some infection or something. And you check a CMP and you see his bicarb is 12. Okay, so deep breath, you say, step one, he's got a metabolic acidosis. Well, how do I now approach this in my head? How do I think this through? Well, go back and think about the way I kind of approach anything that's low in the body. I have another short video on it if you want to watch it, but I can summarize it for you now in 10 seconds. If there is something that's low in the blood, there's kind of three options. Either there wasn't enough intake, or it's in your bloodstream, but it's kind of just hiding somewhere in the bloodstream, or there was enough intake, it's in your bloodstream, but then it's leaving. How do things leave the body? Usually through our mouths, through urine, or through stool. So those are your three options. With anything that's low. Anything that's low is either because there wasn't enough intake, or it's hiding somewhere in your bloodstream, we just haven't picked it up on our lab test, or it's leaving your body through one of the orifices of the body. Let's approach bicarb as the exact same way. Someone's got low bicarbonate, okay? They've got a metabolic acidosis. Well, how do I think about this? Three ways. Well, we don't really have to care too much about intake because bicarb is not really part of the diet. It's not really that kind of thing. So we're left with really two options. Why is my bicarb low? Why is this 80-year-old dude's bicarb low? Two options. The bicarb is there, but it's hiding somewhere, or the bicarb is being lost in urine or stool. Those are my two options. That's it. Those are my two big buckets. So this is a metabolic acidosis either being caused by bicarb that's hidden somewhere in the body, or bicarb that's leaving the body through urine or stool. Now, people are going to jump up and say, well, that's not how I was taught to deal with metabolic acidosis. Back in my day when I learned it in school, metabolic acidosis, we divided it into anion gap versus non-anion gap. That's a common thing we all learn, and I'm going to blow your mind here. So mind-blowing thing number two, here we go, which is that what I'm saying, okay, my two big buckets of either the bicarb is low because it's kind of hidden somewhere in the body, or the bicarb is low because it's being lost in urine or stool, those kind of two big buckets, that is identical. That is the same thing as your metabolic anion gap versus non-anion gap. Mind blown? Stay with me for a second and you'll see what I'm talking about. And I'm going to show you that this term anion gap versus non-anion gap, it's not really a great term. It doesn't really describe what's going on. I'd much rather kind of describe your buckets of what's going on in your head. So here's your two buckets, okay? Stay with me for a second. We're not going to go much longer, and this is really going to change the way you attack metabolic acidosis. Your bicarb is low, okay? So I said there's two big buckets. Either it's being hidden in the body or it's leaving the body. Let's talk about category number one. And what do I mean when I say it's being hidden in the body? That means there is enough bicarb kind of floating around in the body. It's not getting lost in urine or stool, but maybe it's doing its job. What is the job of bicarb? We all kind of use this, an analogy that bicarb is like a sponge, right? Somebody spills Coca-Cola on the table and you want to get rid of it. You put a sponge on it and it soaks it up. And the Coca-Cola is still there, but now it's in your sponge, kind of hidden away in the sponge, and it's no longer apparent when mom walks in and looks at the table. Well, bicarb is the sponge of the body, right? It soaks up acid, even though it might still be there, but it kind of soaks it up so that it's not apparent floating around in the bloodstream. We all remember this calculation or this equation. I don't really care all that much if you memorize it. I don't think I even memorize it all that much, but it's important just to think about conceptually. So you've got your bicarb plus your protons, those two things mixed together to make carbonic acid, okay? So you have acid floating around. The body doesn't like that. So we're created with this unbelievable bicarbonate sponge. It soaks up the acid, and then it turns into this new chemical. Now, what's happening now is your bicarb actually low? Imagine we have a massive load of acid dumped into my bloodstream for some reason. Picture whatever you want. Bicarbonate is not actually low. It's doing its job as a sponge, soaking up all those protons, turning into carbonic acid. Okay? Does that make sense? So this is what I mean when I say it's kind of hidden in the body. Now, that could eventually leave. That is possible, and you could even end up breathing that out. But conceptually, the way to think about it is if I have a massive load of acid dumped into my bloodstream, why does my bicarb end up going low? Because it's doing its job as a sponge, soaking up all those protons and turning into carbonic acid. Now, that would be scenario number one. Okay, why my bicarb would be low. The other big bucket of why my bicarb would be low is because maybe I'm just losing bicarb. I'm spilling bicarb. All right? What are those kind of examples? Well, if someone has tons of watery stool, diarrhea, they can lose bicarb in their stool. Or if someone has an RTA, a renal tubular acidosis, they can lose bicarb in their urine. So those are the two big bucket ways to think about it. Now, last step here. We all know the kind of fishbone diagram. Do you guys know that? The fishbone diagram. Well, in the first column of the fishbone diagram, we've got our sodium and our potassium. Those are our positive ions. In the second column of our fishbone diagram, we've got our chloride on the top and our bicarbonate on the bottom. Okay? The rest of it is BUN, creatinine, glucose. We don't even care about that right now. So we're just going to look at the first part of the fishbone diagram. There's column number 1, sodium and potassium. Column number 2, chloride and bicarbonate. Have you ever noticed, this may be pretty straightforward and simple, that column number 1, those are your positive ions. Column number 2, those are your negative ions. When we talk about an anion gap, this may blow your mind too. When we talk about an anion gap, all we are saying is column number 1 equal to column number 2, or is there a discrepancy? If there's a discrepancy, that means there's an anion gap. Now, stay with me for one more moment. Here we go. I already told you guys that a bicarbonate deficiency, that is a metabolic acidosis. So in column number 2, bicarbonate is going down when you have a metabolic acidosis. Okay, so by definition, your column number 2, where your anions are, is now going down. The only way to make up this discrepancy, to kind of fill the gap, the only thing left on this fishbone, which is a negative ion, is your chloride, right? You see that? So by definition, if I want to close that gap up, then when my bicarb goes down, I need my chloride to go up. I'm going to say it one more time. By definition, if I do not want to have an anion gap, I want to close the gap, then that means that bicarbonate is dropping. That's always the case when we talk about metabolic acidosis. Bicarb dropped, so my chloride would need to rise in response to my bicarb dropping. That means that I have a non-anion gap metabolic acidosis. In other words, we'll make this another point up here. that a NAGMA, a non-anion gap metabolic acidosis, is synonymous with, by definition, it's synonymous with a hyperchloremic metabolic acidosis. And I think that's probably a much better way to describe it. Instead of talking about anion gap or non-anion gap, why don't we just say, instead of non-anion gap metabolic acidosis, let's just call it hyperchloremic. Those two are synonymous by definition. If I have a non-anion gap metabolic acidosis, that means that I have a hyperchloremic metabolic acidosis. Now, let's say my chloride doesn't budge. So my bicarb dropped. Chloride stays exactly where it is. Okay? So that means that there is a loss of anions because my bicarb left and my chloride did not make up for it. Well, what's making up for it? By definition, there must be some other anions floating around that are not picked up on our regular chemistry. We can probably order some fancy labs and look for them, but we don't really care all that much. We have our standard labs. This is what we check. Chloride is the only kind of anion that we look at. There must be, and if chloride is not closing the gap, we know that a human being is net neutral, obviously. So I must have the same amount of positive anions as my negative anions. If chloride is not making up the gap, there must be something else floating around. What is that other thing floating around? We don't really care all that much. We don't test for it, okay? So an anion gap metabolic acidosis, another way to say that is, it is a non-hyperchloremic metabolic acidosis. Chloride is not closing the gap. Something else is filling in that gap. Some other negative anion is floating around in the body, which we don't typically test for. So this may be obvious to you, but what I'm saying is when we say an anion gap or a non-anion gap, that is like a misnomer. You never have a real anion gap. The gap is always closed. You always have an equal number of positive ions and an equal number of negative ions. Those two things are always correlated. When we say anion gap, what we mean is that there is something else floating around which is not picked up on our tests, on our standard lab tests, on our standard BMP. There's something else which is a negative anion, and it's not chloride. It must be something else that's creating the human being, making the human being into a neutral, net neutral electron balance, let's call it, or whatever you want to call it. So, okay, now where am I going with all this? What does all this really matter? This is the final point I'm going to say. This is really going to blow your mind. This is really truly going to blow your mind. This blew my mind when I learned about this for the first time. But here we go. What determines if chloride rises in response to the drop in bicarb? Is there some physiologic something that determines whether that happens or whether it doesn't happen? You ready for this? Here we go. When bicarb is lost from the body through urine or through stool, when that's the pathophysiology, when that is the mechanism causing the acidosis, it's because of a bicarb loss, the body immediately responds by holding on to chloride, and we become hyperchloremic, i.e. non-anion gap. As opposed to the other case, where it's not the loss of bicarb, but there's extra acid floating around. Bicarb is doing its job as the sponge and soaking up all that acid and turning into carbonic acid. When that happens, bicarb is not being lost, rather it's doing its job and kind of disappearing in the bloodstream. When that happens, then there is not hyperchloremia. Chloride does not rise. Chloride rises when we lose bicarb. When the bicarb is doing its job in response to an acid load, then chloride does not rise. What I'm trying to say here is, we're going to take this home. Here we go. What I'm trying to say here is that when we say an anion gap metabolic acidosis, that is the same thing as saying a non-hyperchloremic metabolic acidosis, which is the same thing as saying the pathophysiology of this metabolic acidosis is that there was an increase in acid production and bicarb is not getting lost, but it's doing its job. On the flip side, when we say a non-anion gap metabolic acidosis, and what we mean is a hyperchloremic metabolic acidosis, by definition what we're saying is that the pathophysiology of this person's metabolic acidosis is due to bicarb losses, either through stool or through urine. If that doesn't blow your mind, then I don't know what does.